Got it. Okay. All right. I trust everybody can hear me. Thumbs up, maybe. Very good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm impressed that Bob found that essay on my website. I will point out I wrote that as a graduate student, which is getting increasingly long ago. That I wrote that I think about 30 years ago, actually, on a observing run that was clouded out. This was when I was going to the University of Wyoming, and I was observing though here in Arizona. I was up on Mount Hopkins, south of Tucson, and so tried to jot down some thoughts, and it's held up. That little essay of mine has held up surprisingly well, so that's been very interesting. I'm going to talk about, let me start sharing my screen here and get that going and pull up my slides. I'm going to talk about what is up at Lowell with interferometry. And today I'd like to actually have a few remarks about today in astronomy. Actually, Thursday, November 4th. 2021 has been a very special day. We, over the past almost 2 years, the community has been doing a kind of internal review, the entire U.S. astronomical community. And this has been called the Decadal Survey. And today, that survey was released. And it was kind of a big deal. Imagine not only if today was the Super Bowl in astronomy, but if today was the Super Bowl and it only came once every 10 years. And so basically a lot of expectations and anticipation was held out for this report. So those of us that work in astronomy and like to propose and come up with ideas and come up with things we want to do in astronomy, we've spent the last couple of years pitching these ideas and trying to get people excited about things that can happen. And so for me, one of the things that I like to do is get to the very limits of spatial resolution, to be able to use astronomical instruments that give you the most detail on the sky. And in the Decadal Survey report, you can go look this up from the National Academies. There was a lot of nice things said about interferometry and about the promise that this technique holds for getting to milli-arc-second and even micro-arc-second resolutions on the sky. And so it's been a very interesting day to see these come out. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, and you can maybe go look for that after your meeting. Go Google Decadal Survey in Astronomy, and you'll find a 618-page report, which I'm sure will be till nighttime reading for everybody here. And you can see what the next 10 or even 20 years of astronomy might hold. So yeah, so I'm up at Lowell, I do interferometry. I'm going to talk about actually 3 things that I'm working on. There is the Navy Precision Optical Interferometer, which Bob noted I'm the chief scientist for. We also use interferometer with our 4.3 meter telescope with our 80-inch Lowell Discovery telescope. And so I do something called Speckle interferometry there. And so I'll talk about that. And then finally, the real high ground here, both metaphorically and literally, is to try and take one of these devices and put it into space. And so I'll talk about some work that I've been on that. So to start off with, let's talk about NPOI, the Navy Precision Optical Interferometer. This is a facility that is about 10 miles outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. And it is big enough that, again, if you go to Google and you pull up Google Maps and you type in NPOI, you can actually see it from the high altitude photos that make up the Google Maps. It's a very distinctive Y-shaped array that is just by the lower and upper Lake Mary next to Flagstaff here. And that's because it's big. It's physically very, very large. The NPOI consists of 3 arms, one of which reaches up to the north, one of which goes to the east, one of which goes to the west. And each one of these arms is 250 meters in length, so about 750 feet the length of each arm. And what we've had for about the last 10 years, it's been there for actually about 25 years, but for about the last 10 years, we've been in a state being functional, but really being pretty incomplete. We've been not doing everything we can. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've been taking light from small telescopes near the center of the array, and we send it to a beam combination laboratory here in the back end. And we actually bring the light back together and use it to synthesize a single big telescope. And so when we do that, we use, say, 3 or 4 telescopes and bring that light in. It effectively is pretending like it is a single big telescope. This has actually been done for since the 70s and 80s in the field. And in a certain sense, it's pretty widespread in astronomy. Think about the really big telescopes that are out there. You think about the biggest single piece of glass telescopes that are out there, say like the Gemini telescope in Hawaii, that has a 8.2 meter piece of glass that is the primary mirror of this telescope. And that's used to bring the light down to a secondary mirror, which then goes down to the instruments on the back end. You can then do science. Now, 8.2, 8.4 is about the upper bound of what can be done with a single piece of glass. And there are people that want bigger telescopes. And so there actually are bigger telescopes, say like the Keck telescope, which is actually just nearby Gemini North in Hawaii. And that is effectively a 10 meter telescope. And the way that works is to get to something even bigger than what can be done with a single casting is you can build a mirror out of smaller mirror. And when we do that, you just have to put the mirrors together in such a way that they are all lined up at optical tolerances so that the surface of that primary mirror is basically good to about 10 or 20 nanometers. And when you do that, it basically pretends like it's a single mirror and reflecting light to the back end, again, to cameras and spectrographs and that kind of thing. You can do science with that. And actually, all we really do here with NPOI is it's a lot like Keck, except the mirror segments that are all tiled together to form a single big piece of glass at Keck. All we're actually really kind of doing here at NPOI is omitting the glass in the middle and just spending our money on the outboard pieces of glass. And what's interesting about that is you can get a very, very big mirror, quote unquote. You can get a very, very large mirror. In this case, when we're using the center of the array here, we have essentially a mirror that's about 100 meters in diameter. And so you get a lot of spatial resolution. You're able to pick out fine detail in the sky. But an interesting price that you pay is that you've deleted a lot of the mirror. And so most of the light, most of the starlight that you're looking on the sky is falling on dirt. Most of it's not getting captured by your telescope. You're getting absolutely insane amounts of spatial resolution, but you're losing a lot of sensitivity. So we tend to look at things that are pretty small, but pretty bright. And by and large, that means stellar surfaces. That means we're taking pictures of the surfaces of stars. We're measuring the diameter of stars and getting at other derived quantities such as the temperatures of stars. We've had the center part of the array functional for quite some time. What we have not done is made the end stations here at the ends of the arms functional. And so we've been in the process of trying to commission that. So that's kind of a state of affairs as well. Another thing that's been going on is we have fairly small individual pieces of glass that are capturing light to send to the back end. Right? We've been working with pieces of glass that are about the size of dinner plates. Here's a picture of one of our input stations that we currently have going on. Effectively, once we're done, it's only about 5 inches in diameter. We're basically using multiple 5-inch telescopes to capture light in the sky and send it to the back end. And so we really have to look at really bright, basically anything that you yourself can walk outside and see in these lovely Arizona nighttime skies if you're out of the city. Basically anything that is nigh bright is about what we can do. And so that is these 5-inch and 12-centimeter imaging apertures And we also have things that are like the imaging apertures. We actually do astrometry, where we can actually not only image stars, but we can determine the positions really well. But this is really what's limiting our ability to see faint things on the skies. The fact that our telescopes are effectively very small and sending light to the back end. So one of the things that we've been very interested with the array is we've been wanting to get to bigger telescopes. And so I think it was 3 years ago, we got a grant from the Naval Research Lab to add 3 1-meter telescopes. And so we were really one of the kick-customers for PlaneWave with developing their larger telescopes, their 1-meter telescopes. And so here I am at their shop in Rancho Cucamonga in California. And this is when they were doing early thing with one of these telescopes. And so this is going from basically dinner plate size for the telescope to dinner table size. And so we're going to be picking up about 70 times as much light. And what that means is we're going to be able to go from a limiting magnitude about 5 or 6, so visible, basically naked eye brightness. We're going to pick up about 4 or 5 magnitudes here. And that's going to mean that we can look at things that are a lot fainter. The rub is that these are these scopes are not free, and so one of the things that we want to be able to do is use the telescopes at different points of the array. So along the arms of the array, so you can see a close-up picture here or the overhead view here, we have places where we take light and put it into pipes. These pipes send the light to the center part of the array, and then we can then relay it to the laboratory here. And these pipes have had all the air sucked out of them. And the idea here is that you get beat up pretty badly by going through the atmosphere. Thank you. But I have a little helper here. It's awesome. Very good. When you send light through the atmosphere, as we've all seen, and you look at it at very high magnification, it kind of gets dancing around, and it's getting bright and dim, and that's because of atmospheric seeing. So the first principle that we have is, try not to do anything bad to the light, or at least try not to do anything more bad to your light. And so when we relay the light to the back end, we send it into these pipes, these light pipes that have had all the air sucked out of them. So there's nothing new that is happening to light before it gets to the end. And so we have all these pieces along these arms where we can put telescopes. And in a perfect world, every one of the stations, and along each arm there are 10 stations. So we have up to 3 stations total. Those are places where we can put light into the pipe. And so, if we had unlimited amounts of money, we would put a telescope at every station. The beams in the end, with what we can do in the laboratory, we can handle 6 beams at a time. So that's a little bit of overkill. So given that each one of these telescopes at the time we bought them was $750, what we did was we wanted to be able to move them around the site. And so Buddy, a little too ambitious, decided we will actually be able to pick these things up and move them around. That would be neat, actually. And so we came up with I came up with a plan where we would have one of these Astrohaven domes, one of these clamshell domes, and inside of the dome, there would be a pedestal that the telescope would rest on. That's this pink thing here. And the whole thing would be on a trailer, so that the pedestal could be lifted and lowered by the trailer. When it was lifted, then you could actually the trailer and hitch it to your truck and drive it around the site. And you could actually position the telescopes very close together, could position the telescopes very far apart. In many ways, that's like changing the zoom on your camera lens. When you put the telescope very, very close together, you're getting a very big picture on the sky. So when you spread them very far apart, you're synthesizing a very large mirror. You're sizing a mirror that is 432 meters in size, and that's like a 17,000 inch telescope. Oh my goodness. Hey, could we put this down right here? I've had my dinner delivered to me, but I appreciate that. I'll be right on that in a bit. So, and so this 17,000 inch mirror is what we want to eventually do. Oh, thanks. The idea is we want to be able to move these things around and make use of the 3 1-meter telescopes that we have, and ultimately the potentially up to 6 of them. We're hoping to get money for additional 1-meter telescopes in the future. So this is all very fanciful, but what's been very fun about this is we've actually made this work. We've got telescopes from PlaneWave. We have these domes from Astrohaven. We've discovered that the hitch weight on these trailers is very large. I have a travel trailer. I like to go RVing with my family at national parks, that kind of thing. My travel trailer hitch weight, that regular sort of thing, is about 800 pounds. The hitch weight for these things is about 2,500. And so we've discovered that we need to hitch it up to our Bobcat to pull it around, but that works out just fine. And actually the cat is really maneuverable. So it lets us take these telescopes and move them around the array and put them where we want to. In this case, we're starting off with testing these telescopes very near to each other. And so this is a bit of work that is still processed. We've gotten it to the point where we can, we have the telescopes close together, but we don't quite have the light going into those vacuum pipes yet to get it to the back end. And so that's something that we're going to get going over the next six months or so. And so this has been very exciting to get this going and basically get these telescopes running right now. In addition to that, we're also doing other movements. This is a picture of what the laboratory looks like on the back end. So when we get all this light and put it into the lab and we're trying to basically put it back together, we have to make sure that it all lines up well. And so the mirrors that relay the beams to the back end sometimes will bounce around, and the atmosphere has also been kind of moving the light around, the twinkle in the stars. And so we have a narrow angle tracker that we've been upgrading. And so here's my colleague Dave Mazurkowicz starting to bolt stuff together. This is a very unfortunate thing for him, actually. He was in the lab in March of 2020, and he had been there to do the installation of this new angle tracker system. And when the whole COVID quarantine hit, it came down actually like a ton of bricks at our site because the US Navy was involved and all this sort of thing. And we basically gave him about a half hour to clean out and take a hike. And so we kind of unceremoniously pitched him from the site, which is too bad, but he'll be back in about a month to complete the install and to also do some other stuff that we want installed. In particular, he's using a system called a near infrared fringe tracker. One of the things that is very interesting about how you do interferometry, how you get telescopes to put out light beams that get blended with each other, is you get signals that are matching each pair of telescope to each other. So you do this in a pairwise sense. And the longer the wavelength of light, the easier it is to track those signals. And so a game we're going to play is we're going to track the signals in red light for the kind of the short spacings between telescopes. And the neat thing about that is if you equalize if you align the signals between a pair of telescopes and then the next pair of telescopes and then the next pair and so on and so forth, kind of by default and for free, you get the very far ends and everything in between is then all aligned as well. And so even if the signals at the short wavelengths of light, the blue colors of light, even if those are very hard to track, if you do the tracking in the red, in the near infrared, actually, in colors of light that are actually redder than what our eyes can see, if you do your housekeeping there, then you can turn around and get the actual science signal that you want in the blue comes out free. Then it all gets lined up. And so this is a bit of sleight of hand that we're trying to implement out at the site to get us to very interesting signals in the blue that would otherwise be scrambled by the atmosphere, not able to be seen. And so that's a fun trick that we're going to try and implement. That'll allow us to use a brand new camp that we have there. We have a camera there called Vision that was built up, and then it's been kind of in hibernation. So we've been trying to get it working. One of the problems that it has is that it works in the blue. It works at these short wavelengths of light. And so it hasn't been able to do very good tracking. And with our system that is in the infrared, we should be able to get a good, strong signal from this system and do some very interesting science. So we're getting very excited about that. We also have other bits of hardware improvement that's been going on. One of the things that is part and parcel into bigger telescopes is you're grabbing a bigger chunk of light off the sky as far as the amount of light that's coming from a target you want to look at. A problem is that you're also grabbing a bigger chunk of turbulence that the light has gone through. And so you have to have a way to correct for that when you go to the bigger telescopes. And so we are in the process of getting what are called adaptive optics built for the 3 1-meter telescopes that we have. We've actually just let a contract for 3 systems to be built by a company down in Tucson called Hart Scientific Consulting. Michael Hart is a expert in this kind of stuff, and he's gotten a little spin-off company from the U of A that is going to build up these things for us. And what that does is that basically an adaptive optics system will take from the sky that has been all scrambled up because of turbulence, and you reflect that light off of a little mirror. It's about the size of your thumbnail that has 100 actuators on the back side of the mirror that deform the mirror in such a way that it basically mimics the inverse of that scrambling, the inverse of that turbulence. And so when you bounce light off that mirror, it smooths out the wavefront into a nice flat plane. And when you have a nice flat plane wavefront from one scope and you mix it with another telescope, it basically will allow you to get a signal. It will let you synthesize a big mirror made up of small telescopes. And so we've been in the process of doing that. And then once we can get the adaptive optics correction for our 1-meter telescopes going, you just need to route the light into the back end, and we will get what we call fringes. You get the light to combine in such a way that it gives you a constructive signal, and you can, and in the interferometry game, we call that a fringe. And so we're looking forward to doing it with a short baseline, and then we'll move out to the long ends of the arms, and that's very exciting. All of this has been supported by what we call the Envoy Plus Up. This has been some congressionally mandated money for us, supported by our senators. Martha McSally was very supportive of this while she was in office. And up in the Flagstaff area in the House of Representatives, we have Tom O'Halloran, who's been helping us with this. And so that's been instrumental in helping us make these improvements to the facility and also address a lot of things that have been kind of ignored in terms of maintenance and some very infrastructure things that we want to complete that have been kind of half built at the site. And so in the end, the intent is to make the facility competitive for grant programs from, say, like the National Science Foundation and from NASA, where we can go to the NSF and go to NASA and say, hey, we now have a fully functional facility that is giving not just world-class, but world-leading spatial resolution on the sky. We will have the best amount of spatial resolution in the sky. We'll be able to measure the diameters of stars down to about 80 microarc seconds on the sky. And this is something that nobody else can do. And this lets us have really interesting new science insights that tell us about how stars work and how convection works inside of these stars. These are things that are really important. And so this has been the intent of getting these dollars from Congress, which has been very helpful. And we've already starting to see some fruit for that, which is I mentioned that we've been combining, say, 3 or 4 telescope light at a time. But for the last few months, we've actually ramped it up to taking 6 independent telescopes at once and getting to the point where we blend all of that light at the same time. There are some subsystems, we call these things fast delay lines, that are instrumental in letting us take the light and combine it so that we get a signal that is true to the telescope that we're trying to synthesize with 6 input apertures. And what's really nice about that is, as the number of telescopes you use is ratcheting up, you get more and more and more data. And it's not just, going from 5 to 6 is not just getting you, say, 1/6 more data. Every telescope that you add to an interferometer, it more or less doubles the amount of information that you're getting. Every pair of telescopes, what we call a baseline, and a baseline is useful for measuring sizes of things on the sky. And so you can see how that number starts to tick upwards very quickly. As you go from 2 to 3 telescopes, you go from a baseline to 3 baselines. As you go from 3 to 4, you get from 3 to 6 baselines. But then importantly, on top of that, every triangle you can form of input apertures gives you something called a phase. It gives you something that tells you about not just the size of something on the sky, but the distribution and the brightness on the sky. So is it bright on the left-hand side? Is it bright on the right-hand side? And as you get more and more phase information, you get a better and better ability to take a picture of something on the sky, to at least collect the data that's associated with a picture of something that's on the sky, and then put the picture back together. Because every little bit of information is just a piece of the puzzle. It doesn't actually give you a snapshot like a regular telescope. So in addition to already getting to more efficient operations and being able to operate 6 telescopes like this, we've been able to use this support for other things like a forklift. We've actually been really missing having something like this to move a lot of this heavy equipment around the site, move these telescopes around the site. We actually bought it with a few things in mind, and since it's been on site, it's been used 100 other things, and it's been very useful. And so there's actually a surprising amount of not just precision optical engineering and that sort of thing going on at the site, but a surprising amount of just brute force civil engineering that we have going on with moving dirt and pouring concrete and that kind of thing to make places for where we can park telescopes and have them sit very stably, over the hot days and the cold nights. And so we've had a lot of use out of that. And there's a lot of other things that have been needed to be updated at this 25-year-old facility. There's a lot of things that just get old and need replacing. And so we've been very happy to have this support and be able to, have a lot of jobs at the site, and also make advances where we can be much more efficient and robust. The 1-meter telescopes, as I noted, are not actually linked into the array just yet, but until they are, we've actually just been running them robotically as single aperture telescopes. We actually have a 20-inch telescope up on Mars Hill that's also a plane wave telescope that we've been using to basically develop the software for single aperture 1-meter use. In fact, these are pictures right here, but I think, here we are. This is actually the 20-inch itself running right now up on Mars Hill. Looks like we're taking images of in the Sloan G filter, a 40-second exposure of some is it supergiant stars? I've been doing a survey of supergiant stars for their photometric brightness. This is using the ACP software suite from Bob Denny. That is been very, very useful for us to implement at these telescopes. And so I've been very keen on having these things work with ACP software. So that's been very nice for us. Anyway, it's running in the background. It takes care of all the nighttime observing for me. And I get data that I can use with some of my science studies, which is kind of cool. That is all the long baseline interferometry work. And so now I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about single aperture interferometry. So interesting thing is how a lot of people think of single aperture telescopes as themselves being interferometric in nature. But in fact, they do kind of operate this way. So this is an image of our Lowell Discovery telescope. This is a 4.3 meter telescope that is about an hour outside of Flagstaff, so further down Lake Mary Road than Anderson Mesa, where NPOI is at. One of the things that I do with this is speckle imaging. So what is that? Well, let's first look at the instrument. This was our initial instrument that we called DISY, the differential speckle survey instrument. On the back end of our 4.3 meter telescope here, there's an instrument cube. And so one face of the cube is what holds the telescope, but then the other 5 faces each of those 5 faces has a spot where we can put instrument on, and we can actually have up to 5 instruments located on the telescope at once. And this is really nice because we can pretty rapidly flip between instruments if we're handing off to another researcher over the course of a single night, or if a particular research program that we're doing on our own happens to be able to make use of visible light imaging and then near infrared spectroscopy, or different mixes of instruments can all come there on a single thing that we're looking at. And so this is the thing that I use principally is speckle instrument. And the reason why we call it speckle is it is a camera that looks at very high magnification and at very high speed at the light coming off the sky. And so when you do that, if you're looking at a star, case, this is a very, very slowed down series of images from speckle camera. We have this frames here. And what's going on here is if you look at a star at extremely high magnification through the turbulent atmosphere, it gets all messed up. But if you're doing this very, very fast, it's not smeared. What you happen to see is actually a lot of what we call speckles. And the reason for this is if you think of the atmosphere as at high speed, it actually can have all the distortions that we normally see in a telescope. You can't make it go away if you go at high speed, but you can freeze it out. You can make it so that the turbulence at least doesn't smear on top of it. And the turbulence makes it look like you have many, many small clear apertures that have no problems at all out to space. But the problem is that on our 4.3 meter telescope, you get basically a whole bunch of roughly 10 to 20 to 30 centimeter size sub-apertures scattered over the surface. And each one of those is giving you a nice image to space, but they're all kind of smeared on top of each other. One gives you a speckle. And so what we do here is we take a whole series of these images, and if you just co-at it on top of each other, this is effectively what happens with a long exposure on a regular telescope, you get a smeared out image like this. And this is where seeing comes from. Is basically that dance of the speckles on a integration time that is longer than the atmospheric coherence time, this kind of the time it takes to freeze stuff out, and that's about 10 to 20 to 40 milliseconds. If you go for like 1 second or a 1 minute exposure, that kind of thing, it all smears out and you get a seeing disk. But if you're smart about it and you take these speckles and you do a special mathematical treatment of them. In this case, it's called a Fourier transform. You can actually coadd the Fourier transforms on top of each other, and you get a nice clear signal. And basically that allows the noise of the atmospheric turbulence to get thrown away. In this case, if you see these lines across your image, that's indicative of a couple of sources. And so you can then take the Fourier transform and transform it back into image space. And this is what the image is you're getting two objects here, a primary star and its little companion. And this is what we're up to. This is separation here is about 0.2 arc seconds. And that's about 5 times better seeing limit. In fact, there's a lot of room here as well. If this little secondary star was a little closer in, you could still easily separate these two sources. And you know, in the best of conditions and with a bright source, you can get all the way down to the diffraction limit of the telescope, which in this case is about 0.05 arc second, about 50 milli arc seconds. And this is we do this all the time. We are using this spec technique to look at binary stars and disentangle them. So the question is yours. You know, do you prefer the image on the left? Do you prefer the image on the right? And in the case of looking for very closely separated binary stars, we definitely like the image on the right. And so what's been fun about this is we've been able to look at all kinds of different sources with this speckle technique and doing this so-called Fourier analysis. And we can actually detect little companion stars that had not been known prior, that had not been detected prior. And so, for example, this is a source called Hipparcos 11565. It's 20 parsecs away, about 60 light years away. And this separation here between this primary star and secondary star is about 10 astronomical units, about the same distance between the sun and Saturn. And in this case, it's not a star in a planet, the case of where you have a star and a little secondary star next to it. Since that technique with the DISY instrument has been so successful, we decided to go and build a second generation thing called Quizy. And this is, you know, how I spent COVID was on some of this, where we have a little box we built. This is about 20 inches on a side, and you can buy some optics from vendors like Thorlabs and Newport and just basically bolt it onto this breadboard. The cameras go on the back end here. Here's one of these cameras. Interesting development in astronomy over the last, say, 10, 15 years or so is that the detectors, the very, very sensitive detectors that we use in these instruments, the very best ones nowadays are being built for medical imaging. And so, in fact, the medical imaging people buy tons of these things, which is great for us because it drives the price down. And these detectors are about as good as what you can buy. And so we just buy these things to go on the back end of our instruments like this. And it makes it much more maintainable and easy to use, given that we can get things like this. And if it breaks, you get back to the vendor, they'll send you a new one. It's worked out very, very nice. And so we built up with these 1 meter telescopes out at the array that we're going to be linking into the interferometer. We can also, onto the side of it, test equipment like this and try out these cameras and do the engineering tests where we kind of do the shakedown cruise. And so we built up this thing called Qui, which was the successor to DISY. We tested it out on the 1 meter telescope at NPOI. And here's like with First Light, we had 4 speckle images. And a feature of this Quizy instrument is any light that is going into the speckle camera, we also put here onto a wavefront sensor so that we can even take our Fourier analysis that we're going to be doing here on these speckle images and improvement and an improvement on top of that, since we're the wavefront distortions as well. So with all that, we went from testing in the 1 meters to then putting this over onto the 4.3 meter, the 180-inch telescope that we have, the Lowell Discovery Telescope. And we were able to very quickly do first light at that point, since we'd basically tested all the bugs. And so we're now trying to improve things further, good electronic timing of imaging, and improve the software pipeline on the back end to take advantage of all this data that we have. So it's been very fun to work on this, because you get to build this stuff up yourself, test it, and we've been using it to now do a survey of all of the very, very small mass stars in the solar neighborhood. We're basically looking at all the M dwarfs. M dwarf stars are stars that are, say half the size of our sun down to a tenth the size of our sun. And we've been looking at about 1,200 of these stars to see if they too have a little tiny companion that have been detected. So we've titled this the Pokemon Survey. I don't know if any of you have seen Pokemon, or with your kids or grandkids that like to play Pokemon games. This is basically one of these terrible astronomy acronyms of the pervasive overview of companions with A of every M dwarf in our neighborhood. So that's Pokemon. And the fun part about this is we've been surveying all these dwarfs, and we can even make Pokemon cards where we can show all the things that we detect. Some of these things are very, very close in to their companion. And what's been interesting about this is with these M dwarf stars in our neighborhood, it's been thought that about 1 in 3 have a little companion nearby. And we've been actually able to show that quite a number of these companions have been overlooked. And so the number is actually 1 in slightly more than 3, or actually 1 slightly less than 3 if you actually do the math. But yeah, we've been actually able to demonstrate that the multiplicity rate has been underestimated for these stars. And that's interesting, because that says a lot about how these stars form and if there are planets around them. And it has many wide-ranging implications if you can tweak those numbers by 10%. So that's been stuff that we've been doing with single aperture interferometry. And final thing I'm going to note, how am I doing on time? I think I'm okay. This is kind of the icing on the cake, is one of the things that's a real problem with doing interferometry of sources is you get a lot of spatial resolution, you get a lot of detail on the sky, but you're sitting at the bottom of the Earth's atmosphere, and it's like trying to look through a swimming pool. So let's say you have a coin at the bottom of a swimming pool and you're trying to look at this. It's really hard to see because the atmosphere is a mess to look through. And so ideally, we would like to put an interferometer in space. Now, I've been working with a company in Jacksonville called Redwire. They used to go by Made in Space. And we've been trying to design a spacecraft that would be an interferometer. And one of the things that has always kind of stymied these sorts of investigations in the past is, an interferometer is a big thing. You have a place where you're putting the light back together, but then you have these telescopes that are some distance away from the central combining point. And how do you stuff all of that into a rocket? And what do you do when the rocket goes up and it's shaking everything to pieces and break all your stuff? And so what's been fun about working with Redwire and their Made in Space subsidiary is that we came up with an idea where you launch a very small spacecraft, and the small spacecraft builds itself once you get into space. And so what you have here is a spacecraft that has these outboard mirrors that are going to be reflecting light to your central combiner here, and you have an outboard mirror here that's reflecting light in. But these booms don't exist until you're in space. And once you're in space, you fire up a couple of 3D printers that are on board, and you manufacture them once you get there. And so you can basically have a very small spacecraft that becomes a big spacecraft by building itself in space. And so these booms don't have to fold themselves up, and they don't have to survive launch. They can be very gossamer and they will do just fine in the weightless environment if they only exist in the weightless environment. So this all sounds very science fiction, but the fun part about working with Made in Space is that they actually have been doing a lot of this. They've been flying a large number of units on the International Space Station that do 3D printing in orbit. And so they have a lot of experience with this so far. And they've started to very productively have business where, let's say you're in at the space station and you need a part, you need some kind of part. So historically, what you did is you sent a note down to mission control and they built it, and then they manifested it on a cargo flight that was going to come, and you waited 6 months. Well, what you do now is you get a file sent up to the printer here, and you get the part that you need in about 6 hours. And that's because you print this stuff right on the spot. And so Made in Space has, I've actually lost count of the number of units that they have flying on board the space station to do 3D printing. They've just recently flew a unit to do casting of ceramic parts for testing the manufacture of blades that will go into jet engines. When you grow crystals in space, you have much less of the impurities that would otherwise show up with ground-based crystal growth. And so these are, the ceramic parts that come out of this are potentially much, much stronger than you can do from the ground. There's a fiber optic manufacturing unit that the company has flown that is extruding super high quality fiber optics. And this means that you can get much longer stretches of fiber optics between repeater stations on communications networks that go under the ocean, let's say. And so you can actually have a lot of money that way by using those things. And so there's a lot of manufacturing expertise that they bring to the table in this, and we've been using that to develop this idea of a interferometer that you can put into space. And so that's been a lot of fun. And so one of the things that we did over the last 24 months is come up with designs on how these optics get put together on the outboard units, the tips of the booms. My contribution was optics that we the design for the inboard unit here in the middle. Basically, there's a middle of this spacecraft that takes the light from over here and takes the light from over here, sit together and gets a signal. And the fun part about that is we went from coming up with a design that took the light from the left side and from the right side here in green and in red, and basically melds it together to get a signal. We came up with a design for that, and I actually started building that. Now, the fun part about this was the middle of COVID, wasn't going up to the lab at all, didn't have access to my optics lab. So much to the chagrin of my children, I took over their playroom, and their playroom became my optics lab. And so in April of 2020, this is what it looked like. And by September, this is what it looked like, where we basically had that middle slice of the spacecraft built up. And over here on this side, this kind of left 1/3 of the table on this very, very rickety plastic picnic table, we had basically a synthetic star that was sending light into input apertures here and here. And the magic of interferometry, we're able to get a signal off of that. And so if a plastic pink table in your kid's playroom is representative of a kind of a sloppy space environment, I don't know what is. And so what was fun about that is we got that built up, and I promptly packaged all that up and shipped off to Jacksonville, where they have been integrating that with the rest of emulated spacecraft. And so one of the things that's very nice about that is, you can demonstrate that the whole thing works, and then integrate it into the other parts, and more or less show in a lab environment that the ideas that you have about printing this stuff, because in their lab in Jacksonville, they actually are printing these booms and making the mirrors on the tips of the booms, sending light then into this lab equipment that I have. And you can actually simulate a lot of this stuff and show that it's all going to work. And so we've been pursuing getting that idea developed. we've also started exploring the idea of taking all of these optical bits that we developed in this bit that I did in my kids' playroom. And in addition to a free flyer, we've been also looking at ideas on what if we just did this on the surface of the moon. So you have outboard optics, and outboard optics, you can actually see very far away. You can see the central combiner, and then the one optic here. This is about 100 meters, about 300 feet between everything. Here's a side view of that central combiner. My boss was delighted when they stuck the logo on the side from Lowell. And our idea is that one of the things that was an interesting hallmark of the Apollo program back in the 60s and early 70s was the inclusion of suitcase science, where some very simple, at least simple to operate experiments were unloaded from the lander by the astronauts. They took basically suitcase-sized devices off the LEM and basically set them down on the wrist and pressed an on button, and that was it. That's all they did. And then the instruments ran themselves. And our idea is, with the Artemis program, there's going to be a return to the lunar surface by humans in the next 3-4 years or so. And the idea is to have a suitcase and 2 carry-ons. And the suitcase is the combiner here in the, and the 2 carry-ons are just going to be these small out optics. And they're really pretty small. I mean, this is on the order of probably 10 or 20 pounds. The mirror here is only about 2 inches in size. And because of the fact that you have no atmosphere on the moon, this 2-inch mirror will outperform the 8-meter class mirrors of the bigger telescopes on the ground, because you're no longer limited by the Earth's atmosphere in looking at the sky. And so a very, very modest little suitcase experiment here with its 2 carry-ons here can outperform a significantly bigger industrial-sized astronomical facility on the Earth's surface. And so we're very excited about this idea and are starting to pitch this as something that maybe they want to think about as part of the Artemis program, as they are looking forward to landing big landers on the surface with a lot of capacity for a lot of suitcases. So with that, I am going to take questions. And it's been fun talking about all these fun interferometry things we've been having going on here at Lowell. So we take a pause here, and this thing is, telescope here is still running in the background. It's going to run all night. There we go. So Bob Colvert, maybe you could moderate questions for me. I'm not sure if the questions are in chat or if people ask them themselves, so I'm game for all.
If anybody has a question in here, you can. Oh, we got 2 feet. Yeah, 2 feet going here.
How do we?
You're gonna have to go through you.
All right.
Okay, we just had a little feedback problem. If you're on Zoom, I guess just unmute your microphone and ask the question of Gerard. And if you're in the room here, come up to this PC and scream at it. let me get my question in first.
Sure.
What does the Navy get out of this?
Very good question. So the Navy is interested in this for 2 reasons. The first reason, and most historical, is navigation. When you want to have a fleet of ships, you like to know where they are. And historically, the Navy has supported the Naval Observatory for exactly this purpose. And navigation is 2 things. It is astrometry. It is basically knowing the positions of stars, and time. So many of you are familiar with the very nice book by Davis Sobel called Longitude, where they had the big competition for the best chronometer to take aboard ships, because ships need time to know where they are at. But it's also married to that is shooting the positions of stars. And that's how navigation happened back in the day of the sailing ships and that kind of thing. And interestingly enough, that's actually still how it happens right now. So many people may think, well, navigation nowadays is just this. You know, we all have our cell phones, and our cell phones all talk to GPS in the sky. But the question is, how does GPS know where it is at? Because for your phone to tell you where you're at, it has to get the signal from GPS, and GPS has to know where it is at to tell you that. And the way GPS knows where it is at is by looking at the positions of stars in the sky. And the thing is that as navigation has gotten ever more precise from these electronic devices, and we're getting down to kind of air ellipses that are on the order of 10 feet across, basically, you need increasingly precise stellar positions. And so the best way to get the positions of stars is to have a super big telescope. The bigger the telescope, the better you are at determining where things are in the sky. And you get to a point where a single telescope isn't enough. And so the interferometer is really the way to go to get the very best positions of stars on the sky. And so that's why the U.S. Naval Observatory is interested in the interferometer, the NPOI interferometer on Anderson Mesa. But we actually have two Navy partners. We have the USNO, but we also have the Naval Research Lab. It's a wholly separate piece of the Navy from the USNO, is also partnered in with Lowell as the third part of the tribe that operates NPOI. And they are interested in the interferometer for its ability to look at things in the sky at very high angular resolution. So basically, they want to look at satellites. And for low Earth orbit satellites, there are telescopes like the 3.5 meter Starfire telescope in Albuquerque and the 3.5 meter advanced optical system on Maui. And they do all of the low orbit stuff, the satellites that are 300 kilometers up in the sky. And it's a solved problem. But the geostationary satellites, the direct TV and all things that send you your cable TV and take care of communications and that kind of thing, those telescopes are about 100 times higher up. The stationary orbits are that much further up. They're about 30,000 kilometers up. And so since it's 100 times higher up, you need a telescope that's about 100 times bigger to read the license plate off of those things. And you can't do that with a single aperture telescope. So again, that pushes you in the direction of interferometry. And so that's primarily the interest of the NRL is, you know, when Commander so-and-so loses their direct TV, they want a picture taken of the satellite to see if a fuel tank exploded or something like that. So that's the interest of the two pieces of the Navy in the interferometer.
Okay, thank you. Questions in the room?
No chat, nothing's in the chat.
There's nothing. Oh, John?
I was just curious if, you mentioned about how you could see the small stars next to a bigger star. Does this research lend itself to maybe discovering hot planets like Jupiter or large gas giants? Or does that require a totally different methodology?
So there's two things you need to do that kind of science, to see a planet next to a star or see a star next to a star. And so you need angular resolution. You need the ability to split two things from each other. But then you also need the ability to have contrast. So how faint of a thing can you see next to a bright thing? And in interferometry right now, at least with ground-based stuff, we're kind of getting into the regime of being able to see things that are, let's say, about 1,000 times fainter than the host star, the brain that's next to it. Unfortunately, for looking at planets next to stars, 1,000 to 1 doesn't quite cut it. You actually need to be more in the ballpark of about 10 billion to 1, because planets don't emit light generally; they reflect light generally, and not very well actually. And so a star that is emitting light and its companion planet next to it that's only bouncing a little bit of light off of it, you really need to get down in seeds. There are certainly ideas on how to improve that for interferometers, though there's actually a whole other class of instruments in astronomy called chronography, where you get a much more of a specialized approach to get very, very high contrast levels. And so this has been where a lot of the research has gone in astronomy, is trying to improve chronography instruments rather than interferometry instruments to get to those high contrast levels. Now, in the future, would we build interferometers that do even better? There certainly are ideas that have been floating around in the field to make interferometers that marry not only the high spatial resolution, but then the high contrast levels to really kind of hit the sweet spot of seeing planets next to stars. But none of these have been built yet. So that's still a gleam in our eye to do.
Well,
Go ahead.
so I have a question about the single aperture speckle interferometry.
Yeah.
Does that require that the light coming from the target object be at least semi-coherent?
It does, and generally it is. As far as this is why the separated aperture interferometer as well, is that the light is basically coherent across the separated apertures or across the single aperture with all the speckles on it. The light can be put back together in such a way that you get a interference signal. And this condition, this requirement, actually kind of comes for free with how the light, when you get light from a star that's at interstellar distances, that wavefront of the light that you finally see essentially is like a big plane of light once it hits the Earth's atmosphere, and then coming through the atmosphere, it gets a little bit corrugated. But by and large, it's a coherent signal that you can then put back together if you do it right.
Okay, so I have a small story to tell about someone who made what I think is an interferometer. And we were at Alamo Lake. He organized it, J.D. Matty, and he actually spoke at Lowell Observatory years ago with Coconino and Astronomy Club. And so we had some solar observing, and a Boy Scout was there with a 4.5-inch scope, but he didn't have a solar filter. So JD thought he could take a one of the those solar sunglasses that people have.
Yeah.
One of the films, cut out a hole in a cardboard in cardboard, and put it over his scope. And I told him that that would reduce the resolution. And guess what he did? He just cut out on the opposite side another hole and put the second film over that, and that should have increased the resolution, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah,
that's like a very low-tech interferometer, right?
that's right. You can get the same effect by taking a mask and punching some holes in it and putting it in front of your 35mm camera. Generally speaking, if you put that right in front of the first lens of whatever you're using for the 35mm camera, that's a entrance pupil, and you can still get a perfectly fine image out of that. It's one of the points I sometimes will make during an interferometry talk, but I didn't during this talk, which is the kind of the hidden little secret of telescopes in general is that all telescopes are interferometers. The only way a telescope can work is if you are basically combining the light interferometrically. This is why in a system without the atmosphere, you would normally see if you looked at a distant point source like a star, you would see a single core, but then you have the airy rings around that. In the case of a very very clean seeing condition. The only reason you get airy rings around a central core is because it's diffraction limited. You are interferometrically combining the light, and yeah, it's how I trick other astronomers into thinking they understand interferometry is by starting them off down the road of telling them about single aperture telescopes they think they understand, and then I just point out that they are behaving in an interferometric way to actually work.
Would JD's invention be patentable?
About 300 or 400 years ago.
And I was wondering, have you thought of taking a laser and bouncing it off the mirror that's on the moon to do calibration?
So the trick with that is the return is so very low. I think when they do that, I think they do that out at Lowell Observatory, send the beam out through the 2.7 meter, and they get a return of about a photon a second from that. So it's it just does not a lot of light to play with to do much with.
Okay, thank you.
Bob, there's a chat question.
Oh. Aha. So Bob G asks me in the chat window, interferometers on the moon, will moonquakes present any challenges? Well, interesting enough, I knew nothing about this about 2 months ago, and I have had to give myself a crash course in the lunar vibrational environment, and to think about if this kind of deployment would work. And fortunately, the numbers are good. So there is 3 major sources of vibrational disturbance on the source of the moon. There's kind of the quiescent background level, which is stuff on the moon. If you stuck something on the moon, and there's an event, what you get is about 25 nanometers of displacement of just kind of background vibrational displacement. And fortunately, that's just below about the tolerance of what we can put up with, which is about 30 nanometers. To give you a sense of scale, the diameter of a human hair is, depending on if you're blonde or brunette or whatever, is about 100 micron. And if you divide that by 1,000, that's about 100 nanometers. And so we're talking very small scales. So the quiescent background level is about that. Moonquakes do occur and do shift things by like a millimeter. Fortunately, they're primarily associated with the tides, with basically the fact that, over the course of a month, you get the stretching and bending and warping of the surface of the moon because of the tidal effects of the moon around the Earth. And so you get these moonquakes about every 2 weeks. And so you get things being knocked around about a millimeter every 2 weeks or so, and that's fine. You can actually recalibrate stuff pretty easily on those time scales. You'd be in trouble if that was, every minute, but on a 2-week scale, you take 5 or 10 minutes to recalibrate the relative positions of the optics, and you're fine. The third thing that is of interest is the micrometeorite flux. So if you get something that's 1/10 of a gram, so a gram is about the weight of a paper clip in your hand. If you have something that's a factor of 10 less than that, but it's coming in at hypervelocity speeds at 20 miles per second, that can disturb things. But it appears that the micrometeorite flux over the relative area that would be affecting you is pretty. that you're only going to get I have to look, I forgot what the numbers on this are, but you're going to get a event that may disturb you all for a few weeks, I think is what the numbers were that I looked up. A lot of these numbers are very well documented because there was a ton of seismometers that the Apollo missions put on the surface. And so they did all kinds of fun stuff with that, by the way, because they would apparently measure the background levels and that kind of thing. But then when the next mission would come to the moon, the third stage that would take them to the moon, they would actually deliberately target the moon with that thing after the command module and the LEM had detached from it. And they would impact these things on the moon, so it would be a known actor. And then they would record all the measurements from these seismometers. So I guess they had a ton of fun with throwing stuff at the moon during the 60s and 70s. And so the all environment, as well as the propensity for the surface and the subsurface to transmit seismic activity is pretty well characterized, I think. So that was a bit of interesting research that I've just got done with over the last couple months.
Any other questions here? Oh, one more comment.
If money was no object, how big would you, or could you make this thing? Could you stretch it out beyond what's 250 meters, did you say?
Well, so given that very relaxed requirement, so I boil it down to science questions, and the thing that I would love to do is make a image of a planet around another star. And the funny thing is when I talk to my colleagues about that, in their mind, they're thinking of, oh, I have an image where I have a star and I have a spot next to that star, and I've detected that spot. And this has actually been done. There's examples of some planets that have been directly imaged in that way, where you can see a thing to its host star. In fact, you can actually look up, what is it, HR 8799, and there's in fact 4 planets that have been imaged around this, and you can even see movies where they've imaged these 4 planets over the course of 5-10 years or so, and you can actually see them all kind of in like an auroral reef, orbiting around their central star. That is not what I'm talking about. What I want to see is disk of a planet where you can see continents, and you can see it orbit or rotate, and you can see other continents, and you can do this over the course of its orbit, and you can even see seasonal changes and maybe changes in vegetation as this goes. That is going to require a lot of baseline. So you're probably going to need about 1,000 miles between the telescopes, and big telescopes, 10, 20 meter scopes. But one of the things that remains true is that these techniques still work. These ideas of being able to take the light and relay it to a single point where you synthesize a bigger telescope, that all still works. And those numbers that I'm throwing out there of scale, they seem crazy, but at the same time, if more expertise and infrastructure comes into play with being able to manufacture things in space, like I was talking about with these booms, if you start talking about not just manufacturing the booms that the mirrors are on, but if you start thinking about manufacturing the mirrors themselves in space, suddenly a lot of doors get opened on scale, on how big you can go. We send up mirrors with Hubble, soon with James Webb, within a few weeks, knock on wood. These are all mirrors, but they're big, heavy mirrors because they have to survive launch and they have to fit in a payload shroud. And so there's all kinds of constraints that these mirrors have, but a 100 micron thick layer of something reflective, because that's all Hubble is a school bus sized chunk of infrastructure that's holding about a thimble full of aluminum in the right so that it can reflect. It's holding about, a few hundred micrograms of that. And JWST is the same. It's a bunch of gold, a thin layer held in the right shape. And so if you could send up a thing that prints a paper thin layer of gold and makes it really big, makes it the size of a football field, let's say, you're only set up a couple of thimblefuls of gold to actually make up your mirror. And I have a lot of very grandiose expectations for where in-space manufacture is going to take us. And I think that those expectations are being well borne out by really rapid advances by some of these new companies that are doing new business in space, like Redwire that I've been working with. It's really amazing to see how fast they're moving on some of these things with advancing these technologies. And so these sorts of concepts make defining a very aspirational science goal suddenly well within reach, the order of 10 or 20 years out. That's actually not unthinkable that we can arrive at these places on those sorts of timescales. And so I'm really excited about how the field is moving very fast.
Questions on the floor? Those on the internet? Oh, we want to thank you then, Dr. Van Belle, for the excellent presentation and fielding our questions.
My pleasure.
So with that, one just in a quick sentence or two, is Lowell open for the public? How have you returned to pre-COVID, or are you still ramping up?
So we, sure, yes. And for quite a while, we've been on a reservation only system. And I'd have to check this to verify this to be sure, but we've gone back to a walk-in basis. Okay. And I encourage you to come up, because our Godot Open Deck Observatory, Giovanni Open Deck Observatory is a real treat. We have telescopes there ranging from, our 7-inch Moonraker refractor to a 31-inch Dob to, I think we have a 14 and 17-inch plane waves, all under one roll-away roof building. That's very exciting. And you come and see the progress on our new Astronomy Discovery Center. We've broken ground on that. And I mean, we've broken ground on that. We have next to this 20-inch telescope I just showed you operating, there is a hole in the ground that is about 100 feet across and about 30 feet deep. And we're starting to get out of the excavation phase. And I think we're trying to get the foundations poured on this new visitor center that we're going to have operational in the next few years. And it's very exciting to see this huge edifice that's devoted to conveying some of the excitement that we have about astronomy to the public. It's very exciting to see that start to take shape and rise from the ground.
Okay, well, thank you very much then.
Sure.
All right, so you're kind of excused because we got a business meeting.
Okay. And I did get dinner delivered to me, so I'm going to take a bite at. So thank you very much. I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Okay, turn off your mic. turn my mic on now that you're doing it. Go on. There we go. All right. All right. Let's see if this works here. No, it isn't going to work. I'm going to take images of these and put them on our web's page with the events that we did today. But the kids are very excited and a lot of fun to do. We had a telescope set up to look at the sun, and then Janie did some programs with the moon phases with ping pong balls on pencils. So it turned out really good. We're going to probably see a lot of those kids Saturday night at the Alamo stargazing party out there, the annual party that's going on. So, and the next thing up is John Hyatt. I'm going to let him take the seat here since we got the camera going. He's got a couple more outreaches coming up, and then that should wrap us up for the year. This has been a busy year so far. So come on up here, John.